Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Brief programming note for this episode is that this episode is a little shorter. It's an overview of the Radak on Bereishis and a little bit about the Radak, mainly discussing the new 2-volume Hebrew-English annotated edition published through Feldheim. And then there'll be another episode on the Radak tomorrow, as like a follow-up, with Professor Yitzchak Berger, who published a book recently through Bar-Ilan University Press analyzing the Radak's commentary on Bereishis. So that'll go a little bit more in-depth into the commentary. So stay tuned for that, as well as a regular small talk episode this week. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me sfarmchatter@gmail.com or check out the link and information in the show notes below. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and so on, as well as a link to Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp status, where I post more of the same, just on status. And finally, if you could please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen to podcasts, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and mainly the reviewing is on Apple. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Yoram Bogacz, who is the author of a number of books, including his newest one, which is an edited volume of Radak's commentary to Sefer Bereishis, Pirush David Kimchi, the Radak. This is 2 volumes distributed by Feldheim, and it's a Hebrew-English edition. And I'll just start off right at the beginning and saying why this is very, very important. The Radak only wrote a commentary on Bereishis, on the Torah, and Nach obviously has, and the Hebrew itself was out of print for many years, hard to find, very hard to come by. So now you have the Hebrew text in here, side by side with the English, with extensive footnotes, and we'll discuss Radak and this commentary on Bereishis. So thank you, Yoram, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for hosting me.
Let's start off. Tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I qualified as a chemical engineer many, many years ago and worked for a number of years. And then I joined a kollel for about 2 decades. Baruch Hashem, I had the opportunity to be in kollel for almost 20 years. And since then, I've been writing, teaching, learning.
How did you become interested in Radak specifically?
I'm interested in all commentaries on Chumash and Nach. Radak in particular, because of his elegant use of language, his conciseness, his clarity. I think when it comes to Nach, anyone who learns Nach seriously wouldn't contemplate such a project without Radak. One doesn't learn Nach without Radak Tehillim. It's just concise and elegant and beautifully put. Of course, his mastery of Hebrew is remarkable. And in addition, as you noted, his commentary to Bereishis is virtually unknown. It was just an opportunity to redeem, to beguile this magnificent work, to make it available to mostly to English speakers, but even to Hebrew speakers, because his commentary is so difficult to come by.
We'll talk more about this, but I think that something that I believe you say in the introduction is that it's probably not well known because it's the only sefer that he wrote on Chumash on. He didn't write on anything else. So when you have a Rishon that writes in one sefer, it's very often, it's not so popular. It's not included in Mekayos Gedolos. It's not well known because it's not something you can just open on the whole Chumash or learn on the whole Chumash, and that perhaps is a reason why this fell out of popular favor. While Radak's, everything else from Radak that he wrote is extremely popular, or was, except Bereishis. Is that your theory?
Yes, exactly. As far as we know, his commentary to Bereishis is the last thing that he wrote. He first wrote his classical grammatical works. So there's the well-known Sefer Shorashim, together is Michloel with it. Then he wrote his commentaries on Nach and Tehillim, which I think made him immortal. And only at the end of his life did he get to Bereishis. It seems to have been the last work that he wrote. I assume that he would have loved to write commentaries to the rest of Chumash, and he just never got there. My assumption is that when the first Mekayos Gedolos were published in the 1500s, the publishers wanted commentaries that spanned the entire Chumash. So Rashi, Even Ezra, Ramban, because then you can fit them all and you have a comprehensive commentary. When it came to Radak's commentary, it was only on Bereishis, and it just wouldn't work to have a certain space allotted to his commentary in Bereishis, and then not to have it on the rest of the of the Chumash. So I think that's what led to his commentary on Bereishis just being, well, falling through the cracks, essentially, to the point where, as I write in the introduction, I've come across many Talmidei Chachamim, not just Bnei Torah, but mamish Talmidei Chachamim who weren't aware that Radak wrote a commentary on Bereishis, which is a tragedy.
Yeah, it really is, which is why it's so important that you've now reissued it and made it available once again. So let's talk about Radak a little bit, his biography, who he was, when he lived. So Radak is someone that is born in the latter half of the 12th century, he lives into the 13th century, he's from Provence, South France. But I'll let you talk more about him, Reb David Kimchi, and his family, and his family's legacy, and his very, very important, the Kimchi family, very important family.
Right. As you note, is a Rishon. To put it in context, he is between the Rambam and Ramban. In other words, he lived after the Rambam, and he quotes the Rambam quite often with great reverence, almost awe. In turn, Radak is quoted by Ramban. So that's the time frame that we're speaking about. Born 1160 or thereabouts and died in 1235. So he's born about 50 years after Rashi. As you mentioned, he lived in Provence for all of his life, as far as I know, even though he introduces himself in various of his writings as Hasfaradi, from Spain. His family is from Spain, but they escaped at some point and they moved to Provence. And as far as I know, he spent his entire life in Provence, in Spain. As you mentioned, he was very well known, very well respected. In Shema Gdolim, Shema Gdolim makes a comment about him that is well known. Imen Kemach en Torah. Of course, a play on the words of Pirkei Avos. His contributions are considered so great that they said about him and his father and his brother, Imen Kemach en Torah. Without their contributions, the Torah would be much impoverished. Radak was a Talmud of his father primarily, Rabbi Yosef Kimchi, and then when his father passed away, he was a Talmud of his older brother, Rabbi Moshe. Now, both of them were respected Talmidei Chachamim, both of them wrote commentaries, both of them were great grammarians. Today, they are almost unknown because the young brother, Rabbi David Kimchi, the Radak, eclipsed them. Just his contributions are so fundamental that he eclipsed their works. Yeah, he's a seminal figure in grammar. I think everyone who has any connection to Hebrew grammar has heard of Sefer Sharashim. Those who are more inclined towards the study of grammar, of course, know Sefer Michloil. He was one of the great exponents of the Hebrew language, of Tanakh in his time, and made fundamental contributions. And together with his commentaries on Nach, he's just, it's just true to serve him. Imen Kemach en Torah.
I think you mentioned also his writings. So he wrote on Navi, and he has on Tehillim, he has on Bereishis, Michlel, which was redone recently, the Shirashim. Originally, I think Michlel and Shirashim were one volume, and then they were split later.
That's right. That's correct. It is one Sefer, and later on was split into seven, what we now call Sefer Michlel and Sefer Sharashim. Sefer Michlel is, he wrote it in an attempt to make Hebrew grammar accessible to the average person. He writes that one should know some grammar, but of course one's effort should be mostly directed at learning Torah. So he wanted to produce a compact volume that would be sufficient for a Ben Torah to understand enough grammar. That's what the point of Sefer Michlel was. Today, I think it's a little bit inaccessible. It's quite difficult, I think, for a contemporary English-speaking Ben Torah to get into Sefer Michlel. Sefer Sharashim is much more widely used, and it's a magnificent work. It's a commentary in and of itself, even though it's presented as a book of Sharashim, all the Sharashim in Nach. There's a lot of commentary in it, tremendous amount of commentary on Psukim, because as Radak discusses different roots in Tanakh, he cites other psukim to support his contentions, his explanations. And Sefer Shirashim in itself is an important book of commentary.
I believe the Michal Yoifi in the 16th century, Shlomo ibn Melech from Morocco, his commentary on Tanakh is basically that. I believe he says that he took Shirashim and he essentially turns it into like a commentary. It's basically what he's trying to do. I'm not familiar with his work. That's what he's trying to do, essentially.
Yes, I'm not particularly familiar with it. I've seen it. There's also more a recent attempt to do something similar. Rabbi Moshe Kamlaher did a similar thing. He went through all of Sefer Shirashim and extracted commentary on the other Chumashim that Radak didn't comment on, didn't get to, Shmoyes and Vayikra and Bamidbar and Dvarim. Precisely that, just taking from Radak's other commentaries and Sefer Shirashim and compiling a sort of commentary on the rest of Chumash that Radak never wrote.
To be clear, you're talking about is in the Bereishis edition of Mosar of Kook?
No, it's a separate book by Rav Moshe Kamlaher.
Is that the one who did the Bereishis volume with Mosar of Kook, though, that Radak edition? That's a different one.
I don't think so.
Because I thought they had in there a little bit. I don't have it in front of me. I think they have there some like they tried to bring some material down on the rest. Okay, so Radak, you mentioned, comes after the Rambam, before the Ramban, and he's in Provence. Provence, as we know, that's the location of the Maimonidean controversies and the question on Rambam, and many of them are avid Maimonideans. Where does Radak fall on that? And the Kimchis in general, as it pertains to the Rambam?
I can only speak for Radak himself, not for his brother and father. He deeply admired the Rambam. Whenever he cites the Rambam, it's Rabbeinu Harav Moshe or Harav Gadoil, terms of extreme respect. Even when he disagrees ultimately with the Rambam, he may make the point that he thinks that the explanation is not exactly what the Rambam thought, but with tremendous awe, I would say, for the Rambam. When the controversy over the Moira Nevuchim erupted, Radak supported the Rambam's position. Some say that he traveled also north in order to promote the Rambam. I'm not sure about these fine biographical details, but he in general supported the Rambam. He certainly wasn't one of those who condemned the Rambam for the Moira Nevuchim.
Now let's turn towards the Radak's style of commentary. As you mentioned, he really has Michal Shirashim, but he has plenty of commentary on Tanakh. And something that you have an extensive essay in the beginning of this volume here about Pshat versus Drash and how that pertains to Radak. So first, let's start in general, the Radak style, and then we can get into Pshat versus Drash, how that pertains. But what's the Radak style generally when it comes to his commentaries?
I would say elegant. It's brief and concise. It's, one of the difficulties in learning Ibn Ezra is that it's less accessible. As anyone who's tried to learn Ibn Ezra knows, less accessible, difficult. Radak's commentary is brief. It is concise. It is clear. It is accessible. I would say there's one exception to that, and that is commentary to Parashas Bereishis. That is really not representative of his work. I think if one had to read only his commentary to Parashas Bereishis, one would form a different impression altogether. There, it's lengthy and it's comprehensive, and it's he quotes dozens of authorities, and in fact, I say to people, if you've never learned Radak before, don't start with Parashas Bereishis. Start at Noach. Leave it for the second round. Once you've done the Radak on the whole of Bereishis, and then you can come back and do Bereishis. But in the beginning, his commentary to Bereishis is much lengthier and less accessible. But the rest of it, he's concise. He's crisp. It's just a pleasure to read his words because it's so easy and smooth.
What about when it comes to Pshat versus Drash, especially? This is a big question. So let's zoom out now. What do you have to say about Pshat versus Drash? You wrote an extensive essay about this. Let's talk about the general as applies to the classical Rishonim. You're talking about Ibn Ezra, Rashi, Ramban, and then we'll discuss it as it pertains to Radak. So just in general about Pshat versus Drash before we get to the Radak.
Yes. Well, the first point is that I wouldn't use the term Pshat versus Drash. I would say pshat and drash. These are two aspects of the paradise. We know the Torah is explicated on these four levels. There's pshat and drash and remez and seid. I don't think it's ever an issue of pshat versus drash. There is the pshat level and there is a drash level. Now, the classical commentators had their own emphases. I refer to Even Ezra and Rashbam as arch pashtanim. This is what they did. If you're familiar with what Rashbam writes, when he spoke to his grandfather Rashi and argued that the commentary should be more focused on pshat, and this is what he produced ultimately, a pshat commentary on Chumash. The same thing for Even Ezra. These were arch pashtanim. Rashi, of course, is not like that. Rashi introduces a huge amount of drash and agadata into his commentary. I've seen recently, I saw an estimate that Rashi's commentary is something like 2/3 to 3/4 is citations from Chazal, based on Chazal. And very often it's comments that we would classify as drash. So I would say there's a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, you have, we could say, Baal HaTurim. Baal HaTurim is almost completely divorced from pshat. His commentary, his reliance on gematrias and various connections between words in various places is almost completely divorced from the actual plain meaning of the text. That you could put that on one end of the spectrum. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, you have writers like Even Ezra and Rashbam, whose emphasis is almost entirely on the plain meaning. And then between these two extremes, you have classical commentators Rashi, Ramban, Radak. So Radak, I think, changed his emphasis over his writing. As far as we know, after he wrote his grammatical works, Sefer Michlol, Sefer Sharshim, after that he wrote a commentary on Divrei Hayamim, then on Nevim, then Tehillim, and then at the end of his life he wrote the commentary on Bereishis. I would say that in his commentary to Nevim and Tehillim, there he was far more focused on Pshat. He hardly ever cites Midrashim. When he came to Bereishis, it's not like that. I think he changed his approach, and very often in Bereishis, he will start with the plain meaning of the pasuk and then pivot to drash. It feels like he wanted to give the reader these two aspects, these two approaches to the pasuk. He quotes Midrashim far more often in his commentary to Bereishis than, for example, in his commentary to Nach. And I would say that he doesn't quite fit into the mold of Rashbam Even Ezra as arch pashtanim. He doesn't go as far as Rashi. He's somewhere between those 2 points, mostly focused on the plain meaning, but willing here and there to cite Chazal and to give us a broader view of the subject, both pshat and drash.
Any specific examples to show how he does that?
Well, virtually every pasuk, he will cite some sort of statement from Chazal, but his main focus is to explain the plain meaning. Of course, being the grammarian that he was, he often begins by just explaining difficult words and the roots and what the words actually mean, and then he'll pivot to a statement of Chazal. If you look at my edition, you'll see on almost all psukim, or a large percentage, there's some statement from Chazal about that as well.
Right. Okay. Listen, if you have any specific examples, would definitely be helpful for the listener. But let's talk about, and as you said, just actually before that, this is different than what he does on Nach. It's not the same.
Yeah, I think it's a difference in degree, not in kind. In his commentary to Bereishis, there's just more of drash than there is in his commentary to Nach. But it's a difference of degree and not in kind.
Got it. So in your edition, you have let's talk about how the edition is structured. You have the Hebrew on one side, you have the English on the other side, you have the psukim, you have footnotes. If you could explain, like, again, this is audio, not visual, but if you could explain to the listener, like, the structure and and before we get to how you went about that, translating it, but just give an overview of the edition, if you will.
Right. I'm convinced that the original Hebrew text has to be there. The Sefer is intended to serve, as large a part of the Torah community as possible. So the original commentary has to be there. My contribution is to have given it nikud, just to make it easier to read, and to separate it into paragraphs, and into neat tidbits. So the Hebrew is there. Now, I do point out in the beginning of the Sefer that this is not what they call a scientific edition. So I didn't pore over a dozen different manuscripts in order to determine what the best reading is. This is meant as a popular work for the Torah world to enjoy the commentary of Radak. So I didn't spend too much time on tiny variations between manuscripts, but I do provide the original Hebrew, what Radak wrote, again, with nikud, with punctuation, and separated into various paragraphs. So that's on the Hebrew side. Then the English. So it's my translation, to the best of my ability, of course, to make it easier for English-speaking Bnei Torah to access Radak's commentary. And they're placed next to one another so that you can easily see what I'm referring to in the English. You can just see it on the other side of the page in the Hebrew. Then there are the footnotes, extensive footnotes, several thousand, I think, footnotes which explain to the best of my ability what Radak is trying to say. In those instances when the footnotes would have been too long, I made them into endnotes. So they come at the end of the chapter, and I elaborate to try and explain as much as possible what Radak meant. So it's a very comprehensive work. As you can see, you're holding it in your hands there. It's 2 volumes. It stretches to about 1,600 pages in total, spread over 2 volumes. But I believe that it's still accessible. If you take a particular perek in Bereishis or a particular parsha, you'll see that it's fairly accessible. I think the English is readable. I try to make it as readable and fluent as possible. And in the footnotes, there's a lot of material which I think will satisfy Talmidei Chachamim as well. Citations and references, quotations from other Sfarim, ad makom sheyadoi magaz, to the best of my ability. So I believe that I've been fairly successful in making Radak's commentary accessible not only to ordinary English-speaking Bnei Torah, but even to those who are advanced and want to carry their research further.
Yeah, and what was that translation process like?
Extremely difficult. It took a long, long time. It's difficult. To a certain extent, when you delve into a classical parshan, it's similar in a way to learning a new language. Each parshan has his style, his particular way of writing, his emphases. When you start, it's difficult because you need to get to learn the language, to get to learn this particular commentator's style. So initially, it's difficult. Fortunately, I didn't start with the Bereishis, as this is before. Radak's commentary to Parshas Bereishis is very difficult. It's lengthy, and it's also, encompasses so many different approaches, and he cites many, many different commentators who preceded him. So I didn't start there. I started with Parshas Vayera and then went back. It was a difficult process, but eventually you start to understand the commentator's ways, his style, his particular ways of expression, and at that point it becomes a bit easier. Radak's language, as I said before, it's elegant. He expresses himself with remarkable simplicity. So in that respect, it made the translation work a little bit easier. He avoids, of course, it's a commentary on Chumash, so one doesn't have to grapple with too many philosophical concepts like you would find in Moira Nevuchim, for example. All in all, of course, it was a difficult project, but very much satisfying.
To read some few examples that I saw, just flipping through it, just to show what you mean by elegant language, he says, just flipping through where Shimon Levi went to kill out Shechem, he says, "B'yom hashlishi b'yosem koyavim." So Radak says, "Ki b'yom hashlishi lemilo hamaka yoser kasha." And I'll read your translation. On the third day after the circumcision, the wound is worse. Radak says, "Lefika chetiru Rabbi Seinu zal l'richtza b'chamin b'yom hashlishi shechali is b'Shabbos v'afilu b'chamin shehu chamu b'Shabbos b'pnei shehi sakana." Your translation: this is why Chazal permitted washing it with warm water on the third day, even when it is Shabbos, and even with water that was heated on Shabbos, because this condition constitutes danger. So there you can see where he's bringing in Chazal. That's not a drasha at all. He's actually bringing in Chazal to show you a comparison. Now, another place where he does bring in the classic drasha, where he says, the pasuk says that they went and they took Dina. It says, "Vayichu es Dina, yesh drash, ki lo yirates olotzeis micherpa ad shenishba l'shimin sheyisan, no zeh shenemar v'shol ben aknanes." And as you go, there's a drash. He did not want to wish to leave, as out of a sense of disgrace, until Shimon swore to that he would marry her, which is hinted to in Shemais, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. So, and then you have the note on the bottom, and your footnote, you bring down things like that. Now, jumping ahead later on to the children of Esav, he says, "Alof al livamas." He says, "Adam haya." Radak says that was a male. He says, "Va'afal he shahaya shmoi behei kederach shmois hanikeva beroiv." That despite his name ending in the letter hey, which is usually indicative of a woman's name, and then he continues, "V'gam alivama shem l'nekeva b'zoa parish." If you go back a few psukim, you see alivama is a name of a woman. He says, "Hine shemila mimasreka behei v'achirim zolase v'ine timna his pilegesh alifas Hashem echad me'alu ve'esav timna." See, and you explain, and despite alivama and this very parish being a woman's name, for the name Samla Masreka ends in the letter hey, and he was a man, and other besides. Timna was the concubine of Eliphaz, and she was a woman, and the name of one of the chiefs of Esau was Timna, and he was a man. So just, you see there, I'm trying to show, like, you see there, that's more of a grammatical, he's busy with the letter. Is it hey, is it not hey, is it a man, is it a woman? So you can kind of get a sense of different things that he's doing, and like you're saying, though, it is a elegant, wonderful Hebrew. Those that read Ibn Ezra, as you mentioned earlier, Ibn Ezra would be like a comparison. Ibn Ezra is very choppy, it's very hard to read. He's almost trying to, like, hide his meaning. It's not an easy read, and it's very, very grammatical. Even though the Radak is a grammarian, that's not what this commentary is full of. It's not a grammar commentary. And he said, is it accurate? You went through this entire thing. Is Ibn Ezra more focused on grammar than the Radak is in his commentary on Chumash?
It's hard to give a simple yes or no answer. I would agree with you that Ibn Ezra overall, I think, is less accessible. His language is more difficult, and he often speaks in I wouldn't say quite, he's not trying to not coded language or anything like that, but his words are brief and sometimes enigmatic, let's put it that way. It's fairly difficult to read Ibn Ezra, especially if you're an English speaker. Radak is far easier to read, is much more accessible. As you say, even though he was one of the greatest grammarians in the time of the Rishonim, but his comments on grammar are fairly straightforward. I pointed out in the introduction that I went to fairly great length to make his grammar points accessible. So both in the footnotes, there's also a glossary that contains many, many explanations of grammar terms that Radak uses. All in all, I would say that his work is just accessible. It's just a pleasure to read.
Yeah, and there's many more examples of this. I'm looking here where he says, where Yaakov tells Esav to sell the Bechira, and he first he goes into a grammar thing where he says Mikra Kayoim, and he tells that the letter Chaf is called the Chaf of validation, and he brings you, he's very busy, like when you have getting grammar. They look here in Shmuel, and look here in Mishlei, look over here and over there, and what Yaakov meant to say, and then he gets into what the Bechira included. What do you mean by the Bechira? I'm just reading it translates the birthright encompass an obligation to esteem and honor the firstborn and stand up for him to this being the firstborn. Esau was not worthy of this, and it was difficult for Yaakov to honor such a person, but he could not avoid it because of the custom. Some say it was a custom for the firstborn to have an advantage with respect to his father's estate, similar to the Torah's instructions in Dvarim, a double portion, Pishnayim, and that Esav sold him all of this. Even so, Yaakov was punished for this because his action was contrary to the custom to honor Esav greatly afterwards against his will out of fear for them. And then you bring in your footnote, you start talking about this is the pshat counterpart to the drush that the Bechor gets to bring carbon. So you go on, and there's really a lot here. So even in that one thing, he's talking about pshat. This verse there you see like a verse is he's against the drush, like I was saying earlier. But also you see him bringing in the grammar. You see him bringing the pshat. So it's very. But either way, it's a very nice, like you said. It flows. It's a very easy read. It's not a hard read to read his Hebrew, and you have the English there, so people can get a sense of the English. Now, as you say, the Hebrew, you didn't go through manuscripts, you didn't do, like I said, a scientific edition. Where did you get, what Hebrew text did you use for this?
I relied on a number of widely available editions of Radak. One of them is Ala Torah. I'm sure you're familiar with it, the website Ala Torah, magnificent website that provides amazing resources to the Torah public. Also the Mosad Rav Kook edition, and Chumash, the Toras Chaim Chumash, as well as Rav Moshe Kamler's edition of Radak. So I used the widely available text of Radak's commentary.
Who would you say this work is meant for, in the sense that it's a Radak, so it's meant for everybody, but who, your edition, specifically your Hebrew English, who do you intend to be the reader?
As I said before, I try to make it accessible to everyone. If you are an English-speaking Baal Habayis, I think you'll enjoy it tremendously because the English is there, the footnotes are there. In that situation, that scenario, you could ignore the Hebrew. If you find it difficult to read the original Hebrew of the Radak, you can just go with the English and benefit from his commentary. On the other extreme, I think even Talmidei Chachamim would benefit from this edition, as I said, because in the footnotes I tried to be comprehensive, to cite Radak's sources, to compare his words to those of other Mefarshim, and show his sources in Chazal. I very much hope that it's a work that's intended for everyone. Really, everyone could benefit from it, especially because so few people are familiar with Radak's commentary to Bereishis. Some of his comments are breathtakingly original. I mean, that's true of every Rishon. Every Rishon wrote a commentary on Chumash. It says things that are amazingly original, and Radak is no exception. So because his work is so little known, his commentary on Bereishis is so little known, I think that it's worthwhile for everyone. Let me give you one example of what I mean by breathtaking originality. Avram's discussion, appeal to Hashem regarding the people of Sodom. You're all familiar with it. Avram is aware that Sodom is going to be destroyed, and he pleads with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, if there are 50 righteous men, if there are 40, 30, we're all familiar with the basic outline. Most of us take it for granted because we are familiar with what Rashi says, what Ramban says, that Avram Avinu was pleading for the lives of the inhabitants of Sodom. I think that's how most people understand. Radak has a different approach altogether. He believes, he writes in his commentary, Avram knew that these people were doomed. They were Reshaim, and they were doomed to be punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he wasn't trying to avert that decree. According to Radak, the whole discussion is about the makoim, to spare the makoim, to spare the place, so that after the destruction of the Reshaim, at least the place would remain as this mini Gan Eden, which would be repopulated by tzaddikim. That's what he was trying to convince Hashem not to do, not to destroy the place, which is such a lush, fertile place. He knew that the Reshaim would be punished. He accepted that. He never set out to convince HaKadosh Baruch Hu to spare their lives. What he was doing is pleading with HaKadosh Baruch Hu to at least spare the makoim, to spare the place, again, so that after the destruction of the Reshaim, at least the place would be available for tzaddikim to populate this lush and fertile land. I think this is, I've never seen anyone else say this. Radak, I think, is completely original over here. It's just breathtaking. I never thought of it in those terms. When you read his commentary, you'll see how he focuses on this word hamakoim, the place. Okay, so Rashi and others take hamakoim to mean the inhabitants of the place. But Radak says, no, it means the place. Avram Avinu was pleading with HaKadosh Baruch Hu to spare the place. Such comments in Radak are common, common in the sense that there's so much originality in his commentary. That's what I mean. You'll be surprised almost on every page to see what he says, because most of us are familiar with what Rashi says, what Ramban says, perhaps a little bit with Ibn Ezra. And when you read Radak, it is just astonishingly original. This is just one example of his originality.
Yeah, I'm sure he can give many more examples. There's one thing that would be remiss if we didn't mention, which is included just in all the way in the back of your volume, which is the Pirush HaNistar, the esoteric commentary on the short part of Bereishis. But I think you have to tell the listeners about that.
Initially, when Radak wrote his commentary, he wrote it in two separate parts. The main part is his commentary to Bereishis, which we have been discussing for the past 35 minutes. Separately, he wrote this Pirush HaNistar, which is a commentary to two chapters right at the beginning of Bereishis, to do with the Bria of Adam Arishon and what happens in Gan Eden, the whole episode with the Nachash, the Chet Adam Arishon. And the Pirush HaNistar, it sounds like something Kabbalistic. I don't think it goes that far. It's an explanation in terms of concepts. Radak deliberately wrote it separately to his standard commentary. He didn't want that to be accessible to everyone. And if we say that his commentary to Bereishis is almost unknown, you can say Kal V'chomer, this esoteric commentary that's really very well very much unknown. What I decided ultimately to do is to put it at the back, because I wanted a comprehensive edition. I want one edition that contains everything, all his commentary to Bereishis, including the esoteric commentary. But in order to respect Radak's wishes that this shouldn't be available to everyone, I didn't translate it, and there are no footnotes on that section. So those who are able to tackle it by themselves and benefit from it, by all means. But to respect Radak's wishes, I'll leave it untranslated.
One other thing that I noticed, the Radak he very often goes along with Unkeles, where he's talking about the Sar Tabachim. He says that's the executioner. It says like Unkeles says Rav Katoilaya. There's some other places he goes with Unkeles where he says that Yehuda married a woman from Canaan. He says no, she was not from Canaan. It can't be. They were not supposed to marry Canaanite. And we talked before about Shimon, where he actually brought the Medrash saying that wasn't actually, that was Dino, or maybe there he says maybe they're separate. So again he goes with Unkeles. Right? Is that something that he often does? Does he often like to go with Unkeles's pshat?
I think that is true for all the major Rishonim. Onkelos was a Tana, a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, and Chazal say that Targum Onkelos is really originates in Sinai, Har Sinai. Rashi cites Onkelos left, right, and center. So does Ramban. So I don't think that Radak is unusual in this respect. Everyone looked to Onkelos's comments, and like all the like Rashi and Ramban, Radak also sometimes adopts what Onkelos says, and sometimes disagrees or goes in his own direction. In this respect, I really don't think that Radak is doing anything different in principle to what other Rishonim did.
Okay, I want to mention also here, there is another. It's very interesting how, for a long time, there's nothing on something like this. There's no Radak and Bereishis for many, many years, decades, in fact, since the Mosad of Cook one. And then, I don't know which came first. You published yours in 2 volumes, and then a book came out on about Radak from Yitzchak Berger, Professor Yitzchak Berger through Bar-Ilan University Press. Radak on Genesis, Creation, Humanity, and Torah. Again, that's different. It's just a book focused on a specific thing. But it's interesting how you have, again, no interest, and all of a sudden 2 books on a similar topic, which is interesting to see. So, in closing, I'll put a link in the notes where you can purchase it. Again, it's 2 volumes, around $50, I think. I know it was on sale on Amazon a couple of times, which is nice. So maybe when the time this podcast comes out, it is or it isn't. I guess listeners can check that out. I'll link in the show's notes. And if someone's looking for something original now for Bereishis, you want something original, something a little different. This is something. It's available. You have the Hebrew, you have the English, and it's something like you said. It's a pleasure to read. It's something a little different, not your well, it is a classical Rishon, but it's not the classical in the sense that it's something that everybody's used to, and there are some unique comments, or you can learn some different interesting things from it. So thank you, Yoram, for joining me to discuss the Radak on Bereishis.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. It's a real opportunity, and Yagdil Torah v'yadir. My wish is that Radak's Torah should be spread around the world, around Jewish communities. It's a phenomenal opportunity. Baruch Hashem that I've had this opportunity. The Radak has lain dormant for 7 centuries or so. I'm really grateful that I've had the opportunity to produce this edition, and I'm really grateful to you for giving me this platform to inform the world of Radak's Torah. Thank you.
I realized that I just thanked you, so we should end the podcast, but you just said something that I want to pick up on. You said L'Hagel Torah L'Adid to spread out the Radak. Are you working on more Radak?
Yes, I am. I'm working on Radak on Tehillim. Tehillim is divided into 5 parts. The first part is Tehillim Aleph to Mem Aleph, 1 to 41. I'm working on Radak's commentary to that. I'm in the closing stages, doing the 3rd draft. It's already about 1,000 pages. Radak on Tehillim is just magnificent. It's magnificent. I think he is the commentator par excellence. Nobody would learn Tehillim seriously without Radak. Yeah, he is the commentator on Tehillim. Again, the key features, his remarkable knowledge of Lashon HaKodesh. It's breathtaking. His knowledge and how he connects words here to words there and various phrases. That's number 1. And number 2, there's just an amazing amount of hashkafa in his commentary to Tehillim. It's just wonderful, whether it be on issues of bitachon or how to approach various challenges in one's life. That's another aspect of his work. A third aspect, which is, I suppose, a little bit less relevant to us today, but still very interesting. I'm sure you know that in the Middle Ages, when Radak lived, the 2 Sfarim that Christian theologians were most interested in were Tehillim and Yeshayahu. Of course, they saw all sorts of allusions, to their beliefs in these 2 Sfarim, in Tehillim and Yeshayahu. And Radak spends a significant amount of space refuting their assertions in his commentary to Tehillim. It's quite common, wherever they claim to see certain allusions to various Christian beliefs, Radak spends much time refuting them. So that's a third aspect of his commentary to Tehillim. It's a magnificent work, and in Mitzvah Hashem, it will be published in the next 6 months or so, I hope.
Oh, so it's coming soon. And that's the whole Tehillim or only part of Tehillim that you're publishing now?
The first Sefer, up to and including Tehillim Mem Aleph, 41. So
okay, and you're working on the next part already?
No, I'm trying to finish part 1.
Okay, great. Very much looking forward to that. Okay, so now really it is thank you, and thank you, Yoram, for joining me.
Thank you. All the best.